Hi, I'm Zaylee, and welcome to my Rhombocosa dodecahedron of interests. Today we're in the mythology corner with the 7 deadly sins and the demons associated with them. Most people have heard of the 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, greed, gluttony, and lust, but you may not be familiar with the demons associated with those sins. We have 2 main sources from which we get our lists of the 7 deadly sins demons. The first is the Lantern of Light, written in 1410. The author is unverified, but the work is often attributed to John Wycliffe. Lantern of Light lists Lucifer as pride, Beelzebub as envy, Satan as wrath, Abaddon as sloth, Mammon as greed, Belphegor as gluttony, and Asmodeus as lust. Nearly 200 years later, in 1589, the treatise on Confessions by Evildoers and Witches by Peter Binsfeld included a somewhat different list. Binsfeld's list included Lucifer as pride, Leviathan as envy, Satan as wrath, Belphegor as sloth, Mammon as greed, Beelzebub as gluttony, and Asmodeus as lust. Personally, I only agree with some of them from both lists, which is why I'd like to propose my own list. Let's break each of the sins down. In both the Lantern of Light and the treatise on Confessions, Lucifer is listed as the demon of pride, which makes perfect sense. In the story of Lucifer's fall, we are told that he rebelled against God because he thought he was better than God, which makes having him as the embodiment of pride fit quite well. This seems cut and dry, and I definitely agree with the placement of Lucifer as pride, but let's dig a little deeper. When I first started researching this, I found sources saying that instead of Lucifer being listed as pride in the Lantern of Light, that it was Astaroth. I put my research aside, and a few months later, when I came back to it, I couldn't find any of those sources anymore, and Lucifer was listed instead. This makes much more sense than Astaroth, but why Astaroth? On the surface, Astaroth doesn't seem like a very good fit, and the two don't seem to have very much in common. While I agree that Astaroth isn't a very good fit for pride, he and Lucifer have more in common than you'd think. Lucifer, like the names of many demons, cannot be found in the Bible, and was not the original name for the demon we now use it for. Instead, Lucifer is the name of a minor Roman god of the morning star, which is just Venus. The name means light-bringer and was used as a translation of the Hebrew word Hallel, which had a similar meaning and was used to refer to the devil. Astaroth also didn't start as a demon, but fell prey to a common Christian pastime of turning other cultures' gods into demons. Originally, Astaroth was the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, who was the goddess of love, beauty, sex, war, justice, and the planet Venus. While Astaroth is characterized very differently than Ishtar despite being derived from her, this still gives him a connection to Venus, much like Lucifer, so in a way, it kind of makes sense. Lucifer is still, of course, a much better fit, but I feel like Astaroth still has a place on this list somewhere else. So let's talk about lust. Asmodeus is the demon of lust on both lists, but honestly I couldn't tell you why. He was played up as a demon of lust in later works, but there aren't really many early stories linking him to lust. The closest is a story in which he slays 7 successive husbands of a certain woman on their wedding nights before they are able to consummate the marriage, and while it's thought he might be punishing the men for their carnal desires, this is not the strongest link. I think Astaroth, with his connection to Ishtar, a goddess of love and sex, would make a much better demon of lust. Now, if it weren't for Astaroth, and if there wasn't much more to Asmodeus, I'd leave things as they are and consider this one story to be enough. But there is more to him than this. Asmodeus draws his origins from 2 Zoroastrian figures, Ashma and Ahriman, neither of which have any connection to lust. Ashma is the Zoroastrian demon of wrath, which should tell you where I plan on taking this. Ahriman, on the other hand, is pretty much just Zoroastrianism's version of Satan, who you may remember is the demon of wrath on both lists. Asmodeus is also sometimes considered a demon of revenge, which just feels more wrath-aligned to me. Because of all of this, it makes a lot more sense to me that Asmodeus should be wrath, especially when I feel like Satan is the worst choice for wrath, or really any other deadly sin. So here's the thing about Satan. He's not a demon. Satan is, in its current usage, a title used for a bunch of different demons, including most of the demons on this list. So when you say Satan, who do you mean? Do you mean Lucifer, the demon of pride? Or maybe Asmodeus, who is based on the Zoroastrian version of the devil? Perhaps you mean Beelzebub, or Belial, or Mastema. Satan could refer to any one of these and more. Even before it essentially became a title, it still wasn't a name though, and instead was just a noun meaning accuser or adversary. Satan wasn't even used for supernatural adversaries, but instead for regular human antagonists. I said earlier that Asmodeus was derived from Ahriman, who I referred to as the Zoroastrian version of Satan, but strictly speaking, that's not quite accurate. It would be much more accurate to say that Satan is the Ahriman of the Abrahamic religions, as his depiction was heavily influenced by Ahriman. So I guess in a roundabout way, I'm actually okay with Satan being Wrath, as long as that Satan is Asmodeus. Much like with Wrath, I have beef with one of the demons associated with envy because they're not actually a demon, specifically Leviathan. Beelzebub is fine, and I'll come back to him in a bit. First, I want to talk about how the Leviathan is not a demon, it's a monster. Honestly, most of you who have heard of the Leviathan are probably equally confused as to why it's on a list of demons when it's not one. The Leviathan is a sea serpent and is even derived from an even older story where it is referred to as Lotan, who is one of the servants of the sea god Yam, and is often paralleled with Tiamat, who is also depicted as a sea serpent. Any way you cut it, Leviathan is supposed to be a sea serpent, not a demon, but for whatever reason, back in the 13th century, St. Thomas Aquinas decided to refer to the Leviathan as a demon of envy, and a few hundred years later, Peter Binsfeld followed suit. Leviathan was also sometimes portrayed as Satan, which adds to our list of Satans, and like him, it has no place on this list. Beelzebub, however, makes much more sense. The name Beelzebub is actually a bastardization of Baal-zebub, which means Lord of the Flies, and was used as a possibly derogatory nickname for the god Baal. Originally, Baal and Yahweh, who you might recognize as the Abrahamic god, were part of the same pantheon, and were worshipped alongside each other. Both were considered storm gods, but of the two, Baal was initially the more popular. Until, he wasn't. I feel like he would probably be pretty bitter about this, and more than a little envious of the popularity Yahweh gained over him. The easiest and the best fit of the deadly sins has got to be Mammon as greed. Mammon is a word that literally just means money or wealth. The church ended up personifying Mammon as a demon, at least in part due to a line translated in the King James Version of the Bible that read, "Ye cannot serve God and Mammon." This makes it sound like Mammon is a person rather than a concept, which is made much clearer in more modern translations, which usually read, "You cannot serve God and money." Regardless, Mammon has been solidified as the demonic personification of the concept of greed, making him literally made to represent this sin. Sloth is another deadly sin that's pretty straightforward. Lantern of Light has Abaddon as Sloth, while Binsfield has Belphegor. Of the two, Belphegor has the much stronger connection to Sloth. Outside of being on the list in Lantern of Light, Abaddon doesn't have any other connections to Sloth. I am going to keep him on the list though, as I'm mostly looking to restructure the list rather than add new demons, so we'll come back to him. Besides being on Binsfield's list, Belphegor is specifically said to tempt people to laziness. One way he did this was by suggesting ingenious inventions to people that would allow them to succeed while expending the least amount of effort possible and facilitate their laziness. He is often portrayed sitting in a wheelchair he doesn't actually need to show just how lazy he is. On both lists, the place of gluttony is taken by demons I've already assigned. In Lantern of Light, it's Belphegor, which I feel is only because of how Sloth and Gluttony often go hand in hand. Binsfield, on the other hand, gives us Beelzebub, which I can only assume has something to do with his title as Lord of the Flies. Neither of these are bad connections, but both have stronger connections elsewhere. When I decided I wanted to make my own list of deadly sins demons, I really just wanted to shuffle around the existing ones, since going through all the other demons out there would be so much research. This, of course, leaves me with Abaddon, since I refuse to use Satan and Leviathan, and honestly, he's not a bad fit for Gluttony. Abaddon is often seen as a bottomless pit, something that technically could infinitely devour anything fed into it. In the Book of Revelation, he is described as a king of an army of locusts, which are insects known for their incredibly destructive consumption of all vegetation in their path. I think this is quite fitting for a demon of gluttony, and quite convenient for me, with Abaddon being the last demon on the list. As a recap, here's how my list compares to the other two. Pride is Lucifer, Envy is Beelzebub, Wrath is Asmodeus, Sloth is Belphegor, Greed is Mammon, Gluttony is Abaddon, and Lust is Astaroth. So, what do you think? Do you agree with my list, or would you choose differently? Maybe you'd choose other demons I didn't mention. I'd love to hear about it in the comments.